So this is a series of videos that I've been meaning to make for a long time now, and that is on the topic of Catholic integralism. And the reason why I want to tackle this subject is really twofold. For one, I think it's a topic that has intrinsic worth. If Catholicism has a political philosophy, I think that it can be proved that integralism would be the outcome of its fruition, and we're certainly going to get into that. But for two, I think integralism is unfortunately right now being hijacked by Catholics on the left who are sort of with the help of academics like Adrian Vermeule trying to marry Catholic illiberalism with uh, more or less just left wing social activism. So much so that many of these left wing integralists, like Woke Space Jesuit or Bruv or Kevin Gallagher on Twitter, I think they can rather accurately just be described as Antifa with a Kiro, which I plan on addressing much more directly as the series progresses. Now, thankfully, in spite of this problem, there's a wonderful book on integralism that just came out titled Integralism, A Manual of Political Philosophy. Uh, and I was so impressed not only with the substance of this book, but with the fact that it really brings the whole topic of integralism back to its intellectually respectable roots. That is, authentic Catholic political philosophy grounded in scholastic metaphysics. The authors of this book, Thomas Crean and Alan Finister, um, uh, they're not really interested in placating to the insane demands of a fringe irony leftist Twitter clique. Um, they're much more interested in discerning through thoughtful, intellectual, uh, and spiritual reflection how a Catholic is to apply magisterial teachings to the questions of the state, the nature of the state, and its obligations, rights, and duties, both of the natural and the supernatural realms of political and human life. Um, so, all that being said, let's just dive in here with how the book really starts off, and that is discussing the nature of what constitutes a society as such. Because in order to defend the notion that Catholicism should be integrated into the fabric of civil society, um, which can serve as our working definition of integralism, one must first have a clear indication of what a society as such truly is. And this will force us to ask questions: why is it necessary for man to form himself in a society? Why are we committed to the natural origin of society as opposed to regarding it as some sort of artificial interruption of the state of nature or something like that? Um, Francisco de Vitoria, I think, is particularly insightful here in providing sort of a negative explanation, as it were. Uh, Unlike animals who nature endowed with instinctive capacities to care for themselves, uh, to mankind, nature gave, quote, and I'm quoting Vittoria now, only reason and virtue, leaving him otherwise frail, weak, helpless, and vulnerable, destitute of all defense and lacking in all things, and brought him forth naked and unarmed, like a castaway from a shipwreck, into the midst of the miseries of this life, unable to do anything but bewail and lament his frailty with needless forebodings, as one whose future life will bring so many ills, as the poet said, for in the words of Scripture, um, man that is born of woman is of few days and full of trouble, unquote. So from this negative standpoint, because man's animality, when contrasted against the other animals, is relatively lacking in terms of instinctive capacities for survival, man has to survive principally through the use of his reason and virtue. And while he can, of course, use this rational appetite to develop tools and crafts that could facilitate his solitary survival, they come into their optimal fruition in the social craftsmanship. That is, hierarchically ordering the multitude of humans as a unity for the sake of our common good. Hence, Vittoria also says, quote, in order to make up for these natural deficiencies, mankind was obliged to give up the solitary nomadic life of animals and to live in partnerships or societies, each supporting the other. Man is a social animal not only because he is unable on his own to provide for himself a sufficiency of the physical necessities of existence, but also because his rational soul itself makes him need of this partnership. In other words, precisely because man is a rational animal, he cannot care for his necessities by instinct, but must achieve survival principally through the use of his reason, which is achieved only through collective partnership towards a common end the intellect recognizes as true, and the will would then desire as good. Now, what Crean and Phimister bring to the table is a more positive, metaphysically grounded justification for the necessity of human society, and it is to this end that much of the first chapter is devoted. According to Crean and Phimister, the reason for society is ultimately grounded actually in the metaphysical distinction between essence and existence, which seems kind of odd. You wouldn't necessarily expect it to go all the way down to that level of being, which, as I'm sure you know, by the way, is a particularly Thomistic contribution to Catholic metaphysical thought. Now, the reason for this, according to Crean and Phimister, is because essence and existence are distinct in creatures. They relate to each other as perfectible to the perfect. The act of existence supplies the principle of perfection, and essence limits this perfective act down to this or that mode of being. Hence, essence serves as the limitation of the perfective act of existence. In God alone, of course, this distinction is absent, and it is for this reason that the divine essence is unlimited perfective actuality itself. But because essence limits down the act of being, the multiplication of one common nature into multiple instantiations is a further limitation and diversification of a perfective unity. And wheresoever there is this perfectible diversification within a unity, there is necessarily going to be an unequal variability of the reception of that perfective actuality on part of the instantiations. And because of that, it is natural for those instantiations, in this case, and most fittingly, of course, rational animals, to make up for that variability in perfection by coming together as a social union for the sake of the common good of the collective, which is determined by the unified essence in which they all participate by virtue of their active existence. Hence, the definition of a society, as offered by Crean and Phimister, is as follows. A society would be a union of intelligent beings acting for the sake of an end, or the conscious, coordinated activity of persons for a common end. It is the collective necessity flowing from human nature itself to group multiple persons together as a unity in order to assist each other in achieving the threefold task of human nature, and those are self-preservation, the preservation of the species itself, and the attainment of self-perfection. Now, this is more or less a broadened extension of the nature of friendship, which Crean and Phimister define as a union of persons consisting in the reciprocal willing of each other's good. Thus, given the definition of society just given, friendship is to be considered the proper foundation of a society. Now, Crean and Phimister, they further distinguish between two types of societies, and this is going to be pivotal: imperfect and perfect. And it is the nature of this distinction which is going to establish the argument, the fundamental argument for Catholic integralism. This is a crucially important distinction to get right because it can very easily be misinterpreted, as I'm sure you can anticipate, in such a way that would make integralism come off as just laughably absurd on its face. By a perfect society is meant, according to Crean and Phimister, a social unity that contains two essential aspects. A would be an end aimed firmly and formally at the complete happiness or fulfillment of mankind, the complete happiness, and B, the intrinsic sufficiency within itself to attain that end for those who are members of this perfect society. Now, an imperfect society, as Crean and Phimister warn, is not to be misinterpreted as deficient or lacking in some due good, but it consists in the fact that A, its end is aimed at some partial aspect of man's happiness or fulfillment, and B, it does not contain within itself the sufficiency to attain the realization of this end for members of the society. From this, as Catholics or even broadly Christians, it should be obvious that no temporal institution, no purely temporal institution or society could even in principle have its end as the total and complete happiness of or fulfillment of mankind. That would basically just be pure statism. And that's because by virtue of man's intellect and will, or rational soul, his total and complete happiness can consist not in any finite truth or good, or even a collection of finite truths or goods, but in the unconditioned and infinite truth and good himself, that is God. Hence, it is metaphysically impossible for any purely human society to be a perfect society, because only divine grace and supernatural elevation can establish a perfect society here on earth. And since the imperfect is always ordered toward the perfect, our imperfect societies, such as families or states, must be situated within a perfect society in order for them to truly and fully serve those who are constituted as their members. Thus, the family and the state, even as they provide for partial, natural, and finite goods, must be ordered toward the church, or the mystical body of Christ, the only true perfect society, in order for them to fulfill the needs of man in his whole and entire dignity. Now, it's important to recognize, when we say the church is a perfect society, we must call back to how we defined this earlier, because this can obviously easily be misinterpreted. We aren't saying that the hierarchical structure of the church will be without spot or blemish. Obviously, we have plenty of that to go around right now. What is being said, rather, is that the church as a divine institution contains within its immanent capacity the supernatural elevation of man by grace to partake of the divine nature as its purpose for existence, and the ability to effect this deification in human souls. Because this is necessary for the complete and total perfection of mankind, imperfect societies which have as their aim partial and finite goods for mankind, their members, must be structured in such a way to facilitate the attainment of this supernatural good through the only institution through which this can be attained. And that's, if you will, the foundational argument for integralism upon which everything else in the book is based. As Pope Innocent III beautifully puts it, quote, "As the moon draws its light from the sun, and is in fact lesser than it in both greatness and quality, in position as in effect, so the royal power draws the splendor of its dignity from the pontifical authority. The more it remains in its sight, the greater the light with which it is endowed, and the more it is removed from its vision, the more it declines in splendor." Unquote. So I hope that was a helpful introduction for you. Obviously, I would encourage all of you to get the book that I'm talking about. I'll put a link to that in the description. In the next video, we're just going to go over the next chapter in that book by Crean and Finmister, where we'll discuss in greater detail the precise nature of the common good and the nature of authority. So I hope you'll stick around for that. Remember, I do have a Patreon now. $5 for monthly book recommendations, Q&A priority, and audio files to all my videos, and $10 a month for all of that, plus guaranteed video request on a topic of your choice, so long as it just pertains to philosophy or theology. So thank you all for listening. If you liked the video, go ahead and give it a like. If you had any questions, leave something in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. God bless.